All right, devs, get ready. Because today, we're going deep on AWS Amplify Generation 2.
Oh, yeah.
Whether you've been using Amplify forever or this is your first time,
Right.
we're going to break down all the essential changes for you.
Yeah, and things have gotten pretty interesting with Gen 2. It's a big shift in how we build full-stack apps.
Really big. Like how so?
Well, like, Amplify has leveled up. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Like, it's more mature now.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the biggest change developers will notice?
I think the way Gen 2 handles the backend, it's not this separate thing anymore. Your backend code lives with your front-end code.
Hold on, so you're saying no more managing the backend separately?
Yeah, no more jumping through hoops.
Yeah.
It all lives together in one repo.
So everything is together now. That sounds like a pretty significant change.
It is. And to make things even better, everything is in TypeScript now.
Ah, TypeScript. That's a win for developers who love type safety.
Definitely. Especially if you come from a strongly typed language.
For sure. No more guessing games with data types.
And those TypeScript errors can be lifesavers. Seriously. Okay, so let's walk through setting up a new Amplify Gen 2 project.
Right.
You do the usual npm install to get everything ready.
Right.
And then here's the surprise. No Amplify in it is needed.
Nope.
The backend is already set up for you in a backend folder.
It's all there waiting for you.
It's like Amplify knew what you needed before you even started.
Exactly. And get this, each developer gets their own sandbox environment.
Whoa, hold on. A personal sandbox. Tell me more.
It's like your own private coding space to test and experiment.
So no more worrying about breaking the production build.
Exactly. You can try out new features without affecting anyone else.
That's a game changer for sure. Now let's talk about the new directory structure.
Yeah, it's key to understanding how Gen 2 works.
Okay, lead the way.
Inside that backend folder, you'll find the familiar Amplify concepts like authentication.
Okay.
That's in the auth directory where Cognito lives.
Right.
Each service, like your user pools, has its own subfolder with a resource.ts file.
So that's where the authentication magic happens. Yes. And then there's the data directory.
What's in there?
That's where you define your data models, API, all that good stuff.
It replaces the old AP directory from Gen 1, right?
Exactly. And you'll still find that resource.ts file for your schema definition.
Got it. So we've got auth, we've got data. What about serverless functions?
Those are in the function directory.
Okay.
Each function gets its own directory, which helps keep things organized.
I like that. And what about storage? Where does that fit in?
All your configurations for S3 and other storage services are in the storage folder.
Makes sense. So how does Amplify bring all these backend services together?
There's a special file called backend.ts.
Okay.
Think of it as the conductor that pulls everything together.
So it imports and exports all the backend services.
Yep. And say goodbye to the Amplify configuration file.
Oh, is that gone? So what does the front end use to talk to the backend?
You have the Amplify output directory now.
Ah, so that's the new communication channel.
Exactly. It's like a secret handshake between the front end and back end.
I like that analogy. So in Gen 2, it's all about TypeScript, a structured backend, and no more Amplify push for deployments.
You got it. The deployment process is a lot simpler now.
Oh, really? How so?
You just commit your code and push it to your repository.
That's it.
Amplify takes care of the rest, building and deploying everything automatically.
That's incredibly streamlined.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot easier for both experienced Amplify users and those who are new to it.
For sure. It just makes the whole process more intuitive.
Okay, I'm curious about something you said earlier about adding services manually. Does that mean there are no more magic commands?
Well, there's still some magic happening behind the scenes, but yes, Gen 2 is more hands-on.
So it's about giving developers more control over their backend.
Exactly. You create directories, write your TypeScript files, you're in charge.
So it's more like we're architects of our backend now.
Precisely. And TypeScript plays a huge role here.
I can see that. How does authentication work in Gen 2?
The great thing is that Amplify sets you up with basic authentication using Cognito right out of the box.
So we get username and password authentication for free.
Yep. But if you want to customize the authentication flow, you'll need to do it manually.
Okay, so how would we go about adding custom logic or triggers to our authentication?
You would need to go into the relevant.ts file in the backend auth service directory.
So we're directly modifying the Cognito configuration.
Right. It's best practice to define your custom triggers as separate TypeScript files for better organization.
Makes sense. Can you walk us through a quick example of how we might add a custom trigger?
Sure. Let's say you want to send a welcome email when a new user signs up.
Okay.
You would create a new TypeScript file for this trigger in the backend auth service triggers directory.
So we create a separate file for the trigger.
Yes. And then you would import and configure this trigger within your resource.ts file.
And that tells Cognito to run the custom code when a new user signs up.
Exactly. Now, what if you want to add a service that's not part of the standard Amplify package, like OpenSearch?
That's a great question because I know a lot of developers rely on services like that.
Yeah, and it highlights a key difference in Gen 2. Adding services like OpenSearch requires a bit more manual setup.
So no more waving a magic wand.
Not exactly. You'll need to define the tables you want OpenSearch to index.
Okay.
And then you'll need to run some scripts to sync data between DynamoDB and your OpenSearch cluster.
Sounds like there's a bit of a dance between those two services.
Yeah, but the Amplify documentation usually provides these scripts, so you're not on your own.
That's good to know. Anything else we need to keep in mind?
The key is making sure your OpenSearch service is properly configured in your backend.ts file.
So Amplify knows how to handle it.
Got it.
Okay.
Let's move on to serverless functions. What's changed with creating and managing functions in Gen 2?
All right, I'm all ears.
In Gen 2, organization is key. Each Lambda function gets its own dedicated directory under backend function.
So if we have a function for user registration, it gets its own folder.
Exactly. And a function for processing payments gets another folder. It's all about keeping things structured.
So each function has its own space. What goes inside those directories?
Each directory has its main TypeScript file, where the logic lives, usually called main.ts.
Okay.
And to make things even better, each function also gets its own package.json and tsconfig.json files.
Wow, so we can manage dependencies and TypeScript configurations specifically for each function.
Exactly. And speaking of staying organized, let's talk about Lambda layers.
Lambda layers. Remind me what those are all about.
Let's say you have some code that's used by multiple functions. Instead of duplicating that code, you can create a Lambda layer.
Okay.
You put all that shared code in a dedicated layer directory under backend.
So it's like a central library for our functions.
Right. And then from your functions package.json or in your code, you can reference that shared code.
This is great for keeping our code clean and efficient.
It is. Now let's talk more about those personal sandbox environments.
Yes, those sound amazing. A safe space to play around with our code.
They are. And it's important that each developer creates their own sandbox.
So no sharing sandboxes.
It's best practice to stick to one per developer. It prevents conflicts and keeps things running smoothly.
Okay, I understand. So how do we create these sandboxes?
You can create them in the Amplify console under the Manage Sandboxes section.
And once we have our sandbox, it's ours to experiment with.
Exactly. You can test backend changes, try new features, anything you want without affecting the main development branch.
That's a game changer for sure. Now, what happens if we have a ton of unused sandboxes? That seems like it could create some resource issues.
That's a good point. It's important to delete any unused sandboxes regularly.
So it's like taking out the coding trash.
Yep, you can delete them easily in the Amplify console.
Okay, that makes sense. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, are there any other best practices we should keep in mind with Amplify Gen 2?
Absolutely. I think the most important one is to really embrace TypeScript.
We've talked about that a lot today. It seems like it's essential for Gen 2.
It is. Also, remember to stick to one sandbox per developer.
For sanity's sake. Got it.
Right. And don't forget to clean up those unused sandboxes.
Will do.
Another important thing is to be prepared to get a little more hands-on with things.
So embrace the manual aspects of Gen 2.
Exactly. Amplify gives you a lot of control and flexibility, but that also means you're responsible for managing those details.
Makes sense. What else?
Version control is your best friend. Make sure to commit and pull your code regularly and use branches for new features and bug fixes.
Always good advice.
And finally, the Amplify documentation is your guide. Stay updated with the latest information and guidance.
Always check the docs. Got it. Those are some great tips.
I hope they're helpful. I think with these best practices in mind, you'll be well on your way to mastering Amplify Gen 2.
I agree. I'm feeling a lot more confident about tackling Gen 2 now.
Great.
Thanks for all the insights.
No problem. It's been fun diving into this with you.
Me too.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and talk more about how Amplify Gen 2 impacts our day-to-day development workflow.
Sounds good. I'm excited to dive deeper into that.
So we've talked a lot about the changes in Amplify Gen 2.
Yeah.
But I'm curious how this impacts our daily work. Like you said, no more Amplify push. So how do we deploy our code now?
Well, that's a great question. And it shows how Gen 2 really gets modern development since your backend is in the same place as your front end.
Right.
You deploy it all the same way you would any other code base using Git.
So we just commit our changes, push to the repo, and that's it.
Yeah. Amplify takes care of everything else. It sees the backend changes, builds the resources, and deploys them all for you.
Wow, so Amplify handles all of that automatically.
It does. Like it's working behind the scenes,
Hmm,
you know, making sure everything is deployed correctly.
that's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
It makes the whole process so much smoother.
it does. And it aligns with how a lot of dev teams are already working with continuous integration and deployment.
Right. It's like Amplify is catching up to the best practices we're already using.
Exactly. It's a step towards a better way of building software.
As we've been talking about all these changes,
Yeah.
it's clear that Amplify Gen 2 is a big step forward, especially for those of us who are comfortable with code and infrastructure.
Yeah, I agree. It gives us so much more control over the back end
Right.
while still being easy to use, which is what we love about Amplify.
Exactly. It's like we have the best of both worlds. We can fine-tune everything.
Yep.
But we also have Amplify there to support us.
And let's not forget about the personal sandboxes and TypeScript and the simpler deployment.
Right. All of that makes building full-stack apps so much better.
It does.
So it sounds like Gen 2 is really for devs who like working with code and infrastructure.
It is. It's definitely more pro code, you know? It gives you the tools to build complex apps, but it expects you to know how to use them.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So for developers who are new to Amplify or backend development in general,
Right.
what resources would you recommend to help them get started with Gen 2?
The Amplify documentation is amazing. They've done a great job explaining everything, and there are tons of examples.
So start with the docs.
Yeah. And also check out the Amplify community. There are lots of helpful people on forums and social media who are willing to share their knowledge.
That's good to know. It's always nice to have a community to lean on.
Definitely. And as Amplify keeps evolving, we can expect even more features and improvements.
I'm excited to see what the future holds for Amplify. It feels like they're really pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
I agree. It's a really innovative platform.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot about Amplify Gen 2 today.
We have.
We've talked about the changes, the directory structure, the sandboxes, TypeScript,
Yeah.
and how it all impacts our work as developers.
Hopefully our listeners have a better idea of what Gen 2 is all about now.
I think so. But before we wrap up, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways.
Sounds good.
Okay, so takeaway number 1, your back-end code now lives with your front-end code in the same repo.
Right. Big change from Gen 1.
Yep. Takeaway number 2, TypeScript is your friend.
Yes. Embrace it.
Takeaway number 3, everyone gets their own personal sandbox.
No more fighting over resources.
Exactly. Takeaway number 4, say goodbye to Amplify. Push deployments are done with Git now.
It's much simpler.
And takeaway number 5, Amplify Gen 2 gives you more control over your backend than ever before.
You're in charge now.
And finally, takeaway number 6, don't forget about the Amplify documentation.
It's your best resource.
All right, I think those are some solid takeaways.
I agree.
Our listeners should be ready to start building with Amplify Gen 2 now.
They should.
Okay, so we've covered so much today about Amplify Gen 2.
Yeah, we really have.
But before we wrap up, I want to hear your final thoughts. What's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is don't be scared of the changes in Gen 2. I know it's a lot to take in, especially if you're used to Gen 1.
Right, it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, but once you get over that initial hump and really start using the new structure and TypeScript, you'll see that Gen 2 is super powerful and intuitive. You can build really amazing apps with it.
It's like you're leveling up your skills as a developer.
Exactly. And remember, you have the Amplify community there to support you. The documentation is great, there are forums, and people are always willing to help.
That's good to know. It's a journey, but we're not alone.
Exactly. So to all our listeners out there,
Yeah.
whether you're Amplify pros or just starting out,
Right.
dive into Gen 2. Explore the docs, try out the new features, and join the community. You'll be surprised how quickly you feel comfortable with it.
It's an exciting time to be a developer with all these new tools and possibilities.
It really is. And Amplify Gen 2 is at the forefront of all of that.
I agree. So that wraps up our deep dive into AWS Amplify Generation 2.
Yeah,
Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope you learned a lot today, and we're excited to see what you build.
absolutely. Happy coding.
Until next time.